The first bell rang through the corridors of Crestwood High, bouncing off lockers and footsteps. Students laughed, rushed, shouted down hallways that smelled of pencils and disinfectant. In room 212, Mr. Adrian Hale stood at his desk, watching the clock. His class was silent except for the scratching of pens. History essays, overdue ones. Adrian was the kind of teacher students respected but feared. He was young, only 34, but carried himself with the discipline of someone twice his age. Crisp shirts, polished shoes, voice like calm thunder. He believed in fairness, but fairness wrapped in rules. He used to tell his classes, rules are what make us free. Break them, and you lose that freedom. Most nodded. Some rolled their eyes, but one student, quiet, brown-haired, always sitting near the window, never looked up when he said it. Her name was Leela Moore. 16, smart, too quiet to draw attention, too polite to cause trouble. The kind of student teachers call easy. She never missed class, always submitted on time, and never spoke unless asked to. But that month, she started slipping. Homework missing, eyes red, hands shaking during quizzes. He noticed, but he didn't ask. Because Adrian believed in results, not excuses. When she handed in her midterm project 3 days late, he didn't even read it. He wrote 0 in red ink and pushed it back across her desk. Leela blinked at the paper, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to explain. But he'd already turned away. Deadlines exist for a reason, he said to the class. You meet them or you don't. Life doesn't wait for excuses. No one spoke. Leela just nodded slowly, packed her bag, and whispered, "Yes, sir." That night, Adrian sat at his desk grading papers long after everyone had gone. The hallway lights flickered, echoing his exhaustion. He poured coffee, stretched his shoulders, and found himself staring at her crumpled paper again. The handwriting was beautiful, neat, deliberate. He almost opened it, but the red 0 on top made him feel justified. He sighed, and threw it into the ungraded pile. When he left the classroom, he saw the janitor sweeping. Long night again, Mr. Hale? He smiled faintly, just trying to keep up. Some of these kids, they've got heavy lives, the janitor said quietly. Don't always show it. Adrian nodded politely, but the words lingered. The next morning, Leela didn't come to class, nor the next day. By the third, he called the office. Moore, Leela. She's been absent. Family emergency. I think something about her mother being hospitalized. She left early last week. Adrian froze. Last week? That was the day he'd failed her. That night, he sat awake at his apartment, staring at his untouched dinner. The red 0 haunted him. He'd punished her for something he never asked about. But by the 4th day, she returned. Different. Her eyes were dull, her hair tied messily. She walked slower, no laughter, no notes in the margins of her book like before. Just silence. He wanted to ask if she was okay, but he didn't. He told himself it wasn't his place. Instead, he handed her another assignment sheet. He said, "You can still earn partial credit." She nodded, but didn't speak. A week later, it happened. During a pop quiz, he caught her glancing down at her sleeve, tiny notes scribbled on the inside cuff. "Leela," he said sharply, "stay after class." The other students exchanged looks. When the bell rang, she stood trembling near his desk. "You cheated?" Her voice cracked. I didn't mean... You knew the rules. Tears welled up. "Please, sir, He slammed the quiz on the desk. "You're suspended from the upcoming field trip. And this is an automatic 0. The words left his mouth before he even processed them. She nodded, silent, and walked out. He didn't notice the faint tremor in her hands or the way she stumbled slightly near the door. That evening he stayed late again. He couldn't focus. He kept seeing her face, pale, frightened, almost pleading. He opened her locker file. Inside, among grade reports, was a photograph paperclipped to her emergency card. Leela with a woman in a hospital gown, both smiling weakly. He exhaled, guilt crawling up his spine. He'd been punishing a ghost he didn't understand. The next day, she didn't come to school again. And that's when the call came. The principal's voice was low. "Mr. Hale, you had Leela Moore in your class?" "Yes." "She was found near the old bridge last night. Not hurt, but unstable. Police said she'd been sitting there for hours." He went numb. "She's okay?" "They got her in time. She's with the counselor now. Her mother's condition worsened last week. She's in hospice." He hung up slowly, his hand trembling. That afternoon, when everyone left, he sat alone in the empty classroom. The papers on his desk, red ink everywhere, felt like a crime scene. He looked at her last essay again, the one he'd failed. He opened it for the first time. The first line made his chest tighten. "People don't notice when you stop smiling until they realize they were the reason you stopped smiling." It wasn't an essay. It was a cry. He read all 5 pages about fear, loneliness, her mother's sickness, and the feeling of disappearing. And when he finished, his eyes burned. He whispered, "Oh God, what have I done?" The next morning, he went straight to the counselor's office. "She doesn't want visitors," the counselor said. "Please," he said quietly. "Just 5 minutes." The counselor hesitated. "She wrote something for you." She handed him a small notebook, a diary with his name on a page folded at the top. He sat outside the office, heart pounding, and opened it. Inside, her handwriting flowed like breath. "He's a good teacher. He just doesn't see what his words do. Sometimes I wish he'd look past the grades and see the person. I know he's trying to make us strong. I just wish strength didn't have to hurt so much." His throat closed. She wasn't angry. She still respected him, even after he broke her. He closed the diary, his hands shaking. For the first time in years, he felt something deeper than authority. He felt responsibility. That day, he didn't give out homework. He walked into class and said, "Everyone, I owe you an apology." The students looked up, confused. "For the days I forgot you're human." No one spoke for a long moment. Then one by one, they listened, really listened, to the man who was finally learning what teaching meant. That night, he sat down and wrote a letter to Leela. "You once said rules make us free. I said that too, but I was wrong. Rules without empathy are just walls. If you ever feel alone again, don't hide. Knock. I promise I'll open." He left the letter with the counselor. A week later, she came back. No words, just a small nod in the hallway. He smiled softly and said, "Welcome back, Leela." And for the first time, she smiled, not forced, not fragile, just real. He knew then that second chances don't erase mistakes. They rewrite them with understanding.
The days that followed were a study in small trusts. Leela started handing in late work with a short note of explanation. She came to extra help not as a test taker, but as a learner. And sometimes, slowly, she laughed at a joke with a dry, incredulous sound that made the class look up. Adrian listened when students spoke about the week's readings in class discussions and made space for vulnerabilities rather than penalizing them. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady. It was the kind of change that, when repeated, becomes culture. Not everyone accepted the change. At the next PTA meeting, a local parent's email, shared in a heated thread, accused him of favoritism, of caving to pressure. Another parent, whose own child had benefited from Adrian's old strictness, wrote that the new policies would weaken the school. Dormant attitudes surfaced. Adrian found himself in the middle of a tug of war he had not sought. He could have retreated into defense. Instead, he took the microphone at the next faculty meeting and told the room the truth, that his methods had stemmed from his fear of failing students, from a desire to make them resilient, but that his armor had become a weapon he'd aimed without understanding whom it might wound. He said, "We need accountability, yes, but we also need mercy, a system that sees why a student fails to submit, rather than only tallying the points." Not all shoulders relaxed when he spoke, not all voices softened, but the seed of conversation had been planted. Policies were adjusted, with agreed procedures for reaching out to families when absences or late work occurred, and mandatory trauma-informed training was scheduled for the staff. Adrian enrolled. One evening, weeks after their first meeting, Leela brought him a page torn from her diary. "I think you should read this one now," she said. He opened it with the reverence of a man at confession. It was a short entry, not about grief or school, but about a memory. A father, not hers, teaching a child to draw a straight line and then laughing when it wavered. It ended with a line that took his breath away. "I want to be someone who makes space for mistakes." He closed the diary and looked up. "I want that too," he said simply. The words were small, but steady, like a promise. The arc towards redemption is not a single act. It is a series of smaller acts offered and accepted. Adrian waited for the final test when Leela's mother's condition worsened and the hospice asked whether a teacher could come to a family meeting. He went. It was, he realized, a request not only to show up, but to stand in the raw place where life and teaching intersected. The hospice kitchen smelled like boiled tea and antiseptic. Leela's mother lay propped by pillows, thinner than the photographs in the locker had suggested, but there was a softness when she smiled at Adrian that made my throat close. "You're the one from school," she said in a whisper that needed no explanation. "I heard you'd been kind." He had not known she'd heard anything. He knelt by the bed and listened to the brittle rhythms of a life winding down. He shared the small steps they had taken, policies revised, meetings had, supports for Leela, and he told her, with a voice that trembled, how sorry he was. He spoke less of rules and more of seeing. He promised that if Leela wanted anything from him, he would do it. "She is talented," he said. "We're going to help her finish school without carrying everything alone." Her hand found his and squeezed, surprising him with urgency. "Keep her. Make sure school sees her," she whispered. He understood that this was not permission, it was a charge. The weeks that followed were not grand pronouncements, but small, steady supports. Teachers who adjusted deadlines, a social worker who helped with transport to appointments, peers who formed a study rotation so Leela didn't have to carry every subject alone when a chemo day made hours impossible. Adrian drove her to one appointment when public transport failed and sat in the waiting room shuffling magazines he did not read. On the drive back, Leela told him a story about how she had once painted a mural on a friend's fence and how the whole street had come out to watch. She laughed about the mess they made with paint, and for a moment, the air felt thin and possible. At the end of the semester, Leela turned in a portfolio, not perfect, but honest, with an attached note. "Thank you for seeing me." The phrase hit him like sunlight through a long-closed curtain. He stood at his desk after grades were entered and allowed himself a rare private smile. He had not been heroic. He had been human and persistent. That was enough. News of Leela's small recovery filtered into the community not as an explosion, but as a warm current. The parent who had earlier complained stopped by to ask about the new policies and then left with a softer expression. The board approved the trauma-informed training with a unanimous nod. The faculty met harder conversations with less defensiveness. And in the back of the classroom, where students usually slouched out of habit, one of them raised a hand and said, "Mr. Hale, thanks for changing the assignment. It helped when my grandmother got sick." It was then that he realized the ripple was wider than two. There was no singular absolution. There was only the quiet rebuilding of trust day by day. Adrian learned that punishment without sight could fracture lives. He learned that apology without action was only words. He learned to read the spaces in between deadlines and ask hard questions before assuming the worst. On a bright morning, when the air smelled of early summer and the walls were papered with student projects, Leela walked into class and stopped at his desk. She held out the diary and he took it gently, like an instrument. Inside, toward the back, there was an entry he had not seen before. A short paragraph about hope and a penance that looked like a lot of courage. She met his eyes and nodded. "I think I can finish the year," she said. "Then we'll make sure you can," he replied. It was not a vow to fix everything, it was a promise to be present for the work. In the hum of fluorescent lights and the rustle of papers, a different sound threaded through the room now. Not the sharp report of a red pen marking failure, but the softer rhythm of adults and children working towards something that looked like safety without cages. It would not be perfect. There would be setbacks. But when months later, a nervous parent came into his office to apologize for earlier accusations, Adrian found himself saying, "All of us fail sometimes. The point is what we do next." Outside, summer arrived like a tide and the world moved forward. Inside, the classroom kept its windows open a little more each day. The diary remained in his drawer, but he no longer feared it. He kept it like a compass. It reminded him every morning of the face he had once dismissed and the life he had chosen instead. One of listening, of gentle boundaries, and the hard, quiet work that makes second chances possible.
Heavier than the stack of ungraded papers on his desk was the weight that followed Adrian home every night. It sat in the passenger seat of his car like an unwelcome companion. The image of Leela on the bridge, the lines of her diary still ringing inside his head. He found himself waking before his alarm, hands reaching automatically for his phone to check for messages from the counselor, from the principal, from anyone. Mostly there was silence. Mostly there was paperwork. The principal called first, her voice carefully measured. "We've had concerns from parents," she said. "Some heard the story about Leela. They want answers. They want to know how this happened in our class." She read him the phrases he'd expected: negligence, insensitivity, professional misconduct. "We'll have a meeting with the board on Monday. Can you prepare a statement?" He agreed, and then hung up and sat very still. A statement. How did a man craft words that could undo what his hands had done? He thought of the diary again, of the sentence, "People don't notice when you stop smiling until they realize they were the reason you stopped." He had to do more than speak. He had to act. Word travels quick in a school corridor. By the time Monday arrived, the rumors had a life of their own. Some students whispered that he had been cruel for years. Others defended him, saying he pushed them because he believed in them. Parents filled the bleachers for the meeting with the board. The air tasted like coffee and fury. Cameras were not allowed, but the tension in the room felt like a lens. Adrian stood when his name was called and felt the eyes like a gravity field, pulling truth and falsehood out of him. "We value discipline," the principal began. "We value results, but we value student welfare more." She let the sentence hang and looked at him with an expression that tried to be both stern and fair. "Mr. Hale, please tell us what happened." He could have recited policy, his standard lecture about deadlines and responsibility. Instead, he said, "I failed to see the person behind the work." The words felt small, but the shock in the room was real. A teacher admitting fault. He told them about the zero he had given Leela, about the missing context, about the discovery of her mother's illness in the locker file. He told them about the diary. He did not read it aloud. He could not. He told them he had gone and apologized, that he had written the letter, that he had volunteered to take part in the counseling process. He offered to sit in on sessions to revise his grading policy, to take training in trauma-informed teaching. There were questions. There were parents who demanded suspension. There were a few who wanted his head. There were others, quieter, who tested the edges of his explanation with skepticism. How long had he been like that? Had other students been harmed? The board asked for time to review, to speak to counselors, to look at records. Walking out of the meeting, Adrian felt exposed and strangely relieved. The machine of administration had its gears turning. There would be investigation. Consequences, perhaps. That thought frightened him more than public criticism. Consequences meant space, time to reckon, to change, to prove that he could be different. He welcomed that fear like a teacher welcomes a test. At school the next day, the hallway carried the fragile hum of ordinary life. Teenagers were always spectacularly resilient at pretending normal. Adrian moved through it feeling like a stranger. Leela's locker was a quiet place now, her books still tucked inside as if paused between chapters. He avoided looking directly at it for days and then made himself stop and stand there and breathe. He left a small card, not a board announcement, not a public show, just a single line. "I'm sorry." When she opened the card in her time, he didn't impose himself. He waited outside the counseling office as recommended and let the counselor decide when the next meeting would be. Leela didn't come for a week. The counselors told him they were working slowly. He read academic articles on trauma, attended a seminar the district offered, and sat with a school psychologist for an hour that felt like a mirror. "You're not a bad man, Adrian. You're a human being who made a human mistake. That's not absolution. It's a starting point." The starting point for him was a promise he made in the quiet of his apartment, that he would not let his job be about rules alone. He would change the syllabus to include lived experience reflections, to open spaces where students could explain late work without fear, to build a mechanism where counselors and teachers communicated before assumptions hardened. He drafted emails, he rewritten rubrics, he printed new policy proposals and placed them in the principal's in-tray. Change looks slow to those outside of it. To those inside it, it is invisible until it becomes obvious. He learned to accept that. A week into the reform, one of his colleagues, a younger math teacher who had often rolled his eyes at Adrian's strictness, came by his classroom and left a compliment about the new group reflection assignment. "It's human, Hale," she said. "It's needed." Meanwhile, Leela's name appeared in the counselor's schedule. He received a phone call. She might be ready to meet with him for 5 minutes. He prepared, not for a defense, but for a conversation. He rehearsed saying nothing too neat, nothing too heroic. He rehearsed listening. When she arrived, she was wrapped in a faded jacket, eyes still rimmed with tiredness, but steadier than he had seen. The counselor sat with them. The office smelled of warm tea and paperbacks. Soft chairs softened the edges of everything. Leela sat across from him, diary closed on her lap as if it were a small, confidential planet. "Hi, Leela," he said simply. His voice wavered on the first syllable. He remembered the last thing she'd written about the man who didn't notice when smiles faded. She nodded. "Hi," she said. For the first few minutes, she spoke in near whispers. She told him about the hospital nights, the guilt that came with laughing when her mother slept, the heavy feeling of being both child and caregiver. She never asked for special treatment. She described keeping notes on her sleeve because it made the world feel less floating, like there were anchors she could hang on to. She told him that she had cheated because there were nights she hadn't slept and days she hadn't eaten. There were tests she couldn't focus on because she ran from chemotherapies to school and back. As she talked, he listened, each sentence carving away at his past certainties. He thought of his zero and how it had been slung like a verdict. He swallowed and let the shame find its proper size. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the zero, for not asking, for failing you." The words had weight in them, not because they were scripted, but because he meant each one. She looked at him for a long time. "You're not the only teacher who failed me," she admitted, "but you were the one who could have helped, the one I hoped would. I still respect the idea of fairness. I just thought you could see me as I am." Her voice softened. "You did this too. You punished me because you thought it would help me strong. It didn't. It almost destroyed you. And that is my responsibility." He exhaled, the sound almost a prayer. After the meeting, the counselor and Adrian consulted. Leela agreed to a small plan: weekly meetings, extra time for assignments without penalty when medical issues interfered, and a liaison who would help bridge communication between teachers and the family. He would be part of the plan, not the judge. He would read her writing when invited, he would attend one family meeting at the hospice, if allowed, and he would make himself accountable to the counselor. Outside the office, Leela paused and turned to him. "There's something else," she said. "I wrote things in here for you because I wanted you to know. I never wanted you to feel attacked." She tapped the closed diary. "If you want to read, I'll let you, but I'm only ready sometimes." He accepted the offer with a gratitude so raw it almost made him ache. "Whenever you're ready, Leela. No pressure, no test. Just me."
When she spoke about the latest chemo day, he felt the floor tilt under him as if he were standing at the edge of a different life and recognizing how small his classroom rules were in that context. Sometimes I think if I could just be invisible, things would be easier for everyone, she said. Like I'm not a problem anyone has to fix. The sentence cracked into the night. He thought of the 0 he'd scribbled and how bluntly it had labeled her. He thought of how he'd used fairness like a scalpel when what the situation really needed was suture. In the hush, he reached into his coat and pulled out the small card he kept in his wallet, the one he'd made when he first rebalanced his course. Listen before you grade. He set it on the bench between them like an offering. She smiled, almost imperceptibly. You really changed your syllabus, she said. I saw the note on the board. The casualness of the statement was a hedged compliment. How are you holding up? He asked finally. She considered it. I lie a lot, she admitted. To my teachers sometimes. To my friends. About how tired I am. About whether I'll make it to the test. I hate that. I hate that I have to choose between being honest and being treated like a special case. That's a terrible choice, he said. It isn't one you should have to make. The conversation shifted then, in tone. She began to tell him about small things, how a classmate had once brought her fruit when she missed lunch, how a teacher had once extended a deadline without making a show of it. She told him why she had written things inside her sleeve, not as a cheat necessarily, but as a way to hold visible proof that she existed beyond a table of marks. He listened without defense. He listened the way someone listens to directions across a storm, carefully. They spoke for a long time. He told him about the meetings he'd been to, about the changes he'd proposed, about the times he'd been wrong. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer platitudes. He laid out the practical supports the school had made available. A liaison who would coordinate with her appointments, tutors who could meet in person or online, a classroom protocol that allowed students to request extensions without stigma. She was skeptical of all of it. And rightfully so, because systems promise more than they deliver. But she nodded. She let him hear the commitments. As they rose to leave, she pressed the sketchbook into his hands. She said, I want you to have this. The cover was soft with use. Inside, the pages were filled with faces not yet made whole and with a single small drawing at the back. A line of dashes that became a drawn gate opening. You don't have to read it now, she said. But when you do, read it for what it is, not an accusation. She looked at him then in a way that taught him how careful to be when a young person chose to share their story. Some things I wrote down were because I needed someone to notice, not to judge. He promised he would. He drove her home and waited at a discreet distance until he saw her climb the porch steps and slip inside. He didn't stand under the window and watch. He had learned boundaries. He drove back to the school with a new kind of resolve, a resolve that lived less in rhetoric and more in the small actions that would follow him into the next months. A crisis came in the form that communities fear, a letter. It was not public. It came from a parent who thought the new policies were making the school soft and wrote to the district. The media didn't pounce, but the dean called Adrian in for another conversation. The stress of governance, of balancing competing values, threatened to flatten the tender progress they'd made. But this time, Adrian had allies. The principal sat with him. The counselor testified to the safety plan's success. 2 students, one from a parents' group and one quiet kid who had once been in Adrian's class, stood and said that the changes had helped them when their families had fallen ill. The tide turned. It was slow. It was rarely dramatic. It was punctuated by small mistakes and small recoveries,
A late assignment excused here, a concerned teacher picking up a phone there, a lunchroom monitor redirecting a student to the counselor when they noticed a tremor. Each small intervention was a thread in a net that could catch a falling person before they hit the ground. Month by month, Leela's grayness gave way to an expression that was not happiness so much as steadier living. She still missed school sometimes, she still had bad days, but the class space held more room for imperfection. One day toward the end of the semester, she stood at the front of the class and read a short piece she had written about the idea of attendance. It wasn't a complaint, it was an observation about the way absence could shape expectation, about how rules might feel like roads or like walls depending on who built them. The class listened. They did not cheer, they did not judge, they simply heard. When the year wound down, the school organized a small exhibition, projects from students who had worked with the shelter, the mural kids, the after-school artists. Leela's work hung with a quiet confidence, portraits that saw people in their small fractures and in their tender recoveries. She had written next to one portrait a line that Adrian kept turning over in his mind. "A person is not a grade. A life is a story with chapters you cannot argue away." He felt that line like a benediction. At graduation, the principal asked him to stand and be recognized, not for salvation, but for the steady labor of engaging in change. He accepted, awkward and grateful, thinking about the nights he'd spent reading diaries and the mornings he'd stayed up drafting policy. Lila's mother had been too ill to attend in person, but she called and her voice on the phone was full of an exhausted gratitude that made his eyes sting. "Thank you for keeping my girl," she said, in a voice that had been hollowed and then filled with something like relief. The community never became perfect. There were still arguments about standards. There were still eyes that measured him with the old scale. But a different music had begun to play in the hallways. Small acts of mutual care that were visible in the way students lingered, then agreed to help each other study. In the way a teacher had walked a student to the nurse when they'd looked faint. In the way parents who had once been furious at him came to the meetings and spoke of their own mistakes with a new humility. He still kept the diary in a drawer of his desk, but he no longer feared the pages. He had learned how a page could be a bridge. One afternoon, months after the bridge night, Leela left it on his desk. She wrote a short note on the front. "For when you forget why you taught." Inside was a single sentence, small and luminous. "I did not leave because of you. I left to find the world where my breath fit." He folded the diary carefully and pushed it back into the drawer like a talisman. That winter, when the snow settled on the windows and the classrooms grew quiet for holiday pause, he walked home with a new rhythm. The shape of guilt had altered into responsibility. The shape of fear had softened into courage. He had not become a saint. He had become a man who had learned to notice, to ask, and to bear witness.
He opened the classroom door before the bell and let in the morning light like a small apology. It felt deliberate, that gentleness, a plain action that he hoped would be read as something more than symbolic. The semester was moving forward, with paper deadlines rewritten and spaces carved into the lesson plans for stories that had once been too delicate to mention. He still caught students' eyes in the hall and saw the way some of them measured him against the old rumor and the new version. Both gauges lived in the same rooms and both needed recalibration. Lila had been coming in more regularly. Her hair was pulled back in a practical knot. She brought a thermos that she insisted was only coffee, though he'd caught her sipping from it when he thought she wasn't looking. She handed in work with brief notes. Clinic day, or late, chemo. No one stared. The class had begun to reset its assumptions. They asked, sometimes haltingly, sometimes with clumsy kindness, whether she needed notes or a peer tutor. It was small, and it mattered. The board's decision landed without the pomp he'd feared. There was an official reprimand, more procedural than punitive, and a requirement that he attend restorative practices sessions with a mediator and 2 other teachers. He welcomed it. The meetings were painful in ways he hadn't expected, sitting in a circle and listening to other educators talk about harm, naming moments where their own fear hardened into rules. He spoke less and listened more, which felt, at first, like penance. But soon he realized the listening was also repair. In one of those sessions, an older teacher, a woman who taught literature for 30 years, reached across the circle and said, "Discipline without story is a ledger. Disciplined with story is a classroom." He wrote that line down and taped it above his desk. It helped him remember that grades are not the only record a teacher keeps. He learned, too, how to make practical systems that didn't demand heroism. He partnered with a counselor to institute a safe note protocol, a discreet way a student could inform a teacher about a crisis without fear of immediate exposure and a series of contacts the school would then make. He spoke at an in-service about trauma-informed approaches. His voice shook at the start, steadied by the knowledge that change came in patient increments. One evening, after a long day of parent meetings and reframed rubrics, he stayed late to prepare a lesson. He loved the subject, the history of democratic movements, the slow architecture of rights. It felt wrong then, somehow, to teach about freedom while he carried the memory of a locked door like a stone in his pocket. He was sorting transparencies when his phone buzzed. An unknown number, then a short message. He didn't open it for a moment. None of the tones since the bridge night had been especially joyful. Finally, he thumbed the screen. "Not ready. Gone for a walk. Don't come. L." His stomach dropped. The words were brief but unmistakable. A walk could be a breath, or it could be a direction. He read it twice, looked at the time, and felt the old impulse to respect privacy war with the new vow to act. He texted the counselor, then called. The counselor didn't pick up. He called the principal, who answered immediately, and said, "Go, please go." He left the lights on in room 212 and jogged out into the evening air that smelled faintly of rain. He thought of every time he'd spoken with clarity and firmness in class, every time he'd imagined that a fast, bright reprimand would fix in young people the habit of being reliable. He imagined now that those moments might have instead been cliffs a child had to navigate. He drove toward the river where she'd gone last time, toward the old bridge, toward the places she'd once drawn with so much attention to light. The bridge was shrouded in night. A wind ran along the water and made the lamplights tremble. He saw her at the far end, small against the expanse, knees drawn, hoodie up despite the season. She had her sketchbook on her lap, body hunched, face in shadow. For a second he thought of turning back, of leaving the choice to her. Then he remembered the line she had written, "People don't notice when you stop smiling until they realize they were the reason." He kept walking. She heard his footsteps and looked up. The surprise on her face didn't have armor. It was raw and immediate. "You came," she said. "I did," he said. He sat down a respectful distance away, on the same bench where students sometimes came to avoid a crowded cafeteria. "Can I sit?" "No," she said at first. Then after a breath, "Okay." The silence between them was heavy but not hostile. He didn't try to apologize again with words he'd used before. Instead, he asked quietly, "Are you all right?" She looked at him, and he saw something he almost missed. Shame, yes, but also a stubborn reserve of self-protection. "I'm tired," she said, "of pretending, of being two people, one at home and one at school." He listened. He had to. He had to bring no solutions, only presence.
The next year passed like seasons changing in small gestures, not abrupt, not loud, just steady and full of ordinary weather. The school corridors carried the same sounds, sneakers against tile, the rush of lockers slamming shut, the bells slicing the air at precise intervals. Yet something in the rhythm had changed. People lingered longer in conversations, asked questions they might have avoided before, and when silence filled a space, it didn't feel so awkward anymore. Adrian Hale still taught in room 212,
But the room had changed too. The walls that were once bare now held framed prints of student art, Leela's paintings among them. One showed a hand holding a pencil above an open notebook. Another was of a cracked window letting in light. Below it, in small writing, she had scrawled, "Light still finds a way." Sometimes when the morning sun caught that picture just right, the whole classroom glowed like forgiveness. Leela had finished the year with strong marks. Not perfect ones, but honest ones, and that mattered more. Her mother had passed away in early summer, peacefully, surrounded by people who had learned from Leela's courage how to sit quietly in pain without needing to fix it. At the funeral, Adrian stood in the back, not as a teacher, but as one of many who had been changed by her. She saw him there, gave a small nod, and he returned it. Nothing more was needed. He spent the following months teaching summer school, smaller classes, slower pace. Some afternoons he stayed after hours, sitting by the window with coffee, thinking about how different his life had become. There was still paperwork, still deadlines, still the sound of teenagers grumbling about assignments, but the meaning had deepened. He realized he no longer thought of teaching as a performance of control, but as an act of witnessing, seeing his students, listening to what they didn't say. That was the real curriculum. It was late September when he saw her again. He had just finished a lecture about civil rights and compassion, 2 words he'd started using in the same breath, when he noticed someone standing at the back of the hall. The hair was shorter, darker now, but the eyes were unmistakable. Leela. She was holding a small canvas portfolio, nervously shifting it from one arm to another. He dismissed the class early. Students filed out in chatter and laughter until the room fell silent again. "You came back," he said, smiling gently. She nodded. "I had to drop something off. The counselor said it should go to you." He opened it carefully. Inside were pages of sketches, faces of her classmates, moments of hallway laughter, drawings of her mother in profile, and one of him standing at the front of a classroom holding a piece of chalk mid-sentence. The caption below it read, "He learned to listen." He swallowed hard. "You didn't have to give me this." She said, "I wanted to. You told me once that second chances don't erase mistakes, they rewrite them. I think this is mine." He nodded slowly. "You planning to study art?" She said, "Art therapy." She said softly, "I got accepted to Brighton College, full scholarship." Something warm and fierce spread through his chest. "Leela, that's incredible." She shrugged shyly. "It's not a big school." "It doesn't have to be," he said. "It's yours." They sat in silence for a moment. The light slanted through the blinds, turning the dust in the air to gold. She looked around the classroom. "It's strange. I used to feel trapped here, but now it feels like—" She hesitated. "Like a beginning." "It always was," he said. "You just had to draw the door yourself." That night, after she left, he walked home slower than usual, the sound of autumn leaves crunching beneath his shoes. The air smelled faintly of rain and nostalgia. At home, he placed her sketches on his kitchen table, poured tea, and sat staring at the drawing of himself. He learned to listen. He had spent years teaching others to meet expectations, but she had taught him what no textbook ever could, that expectations without understanding are just another form of silence. He thought of the first day he met her. Quiet girl, window seat, shy smile. How easy it had been to miss the storm behind her calm. How quickly he had mistaken quiet for obedience. He remembered the way she looked on the bridge, fragile and fierce at the same time. The way her voice trembled when she said, "You came." He smiled faintly. By winter, the district had adopted many of his pilot reforms. The Safe Notes system became a standard across several schools. Teachers who had once been skeptical now came to him for advice. "You're the compassion guy now," they joked. He laughed softly when they said it, but he never let it make him proud. Pride was what had blinded him before. Now he measured his success in quieter metrics: a student's relaxed shoulders, a late assignment explained instead of excused, a tear that could exist in his classroom without shame. He still had hard days. There were moments when students tested limits, when his patience wore thin, when old habits whispered, "Raise your voice, tighten control." But then he'd look at the drawing on his desk, that small reminder of how strength and gentleness could live together, and he would take a breath, lower his tone, and start again. Years later, after he'd transferred to a community college and begun teaching future educators, he received a letter in familiar handwriting. It arrived in spring, tucked between course evaluations and student essays. The envelope was unmarked except for his name. Inside, on simple lined paper, was a short note. "Mr. Hale, I graduated last month, not top of the class, but with my own kind of honor. I work now at a small center that helps kids who don't talk much. They draw. I listen. Every time a student hands me something they've made, I think of how you once read my words too late, but then never stopped reading after that. I guess that's what real teaching is. Thank you for finding me before I disappeared completely. Leela." He read it twice, then 3 times. The words blurred until he couldn't tell where the ink ended and his tears began. He folded it carefully, placed it beside her old diary in his drawer, and whispered, "You found me too." A few months after that, he was invited to an art exhibition by the district's alumni. The theme? Healing through expression. He went quietly, as a guest, blending into the crowd of parents and teachers. The gallery smelled of varnish and faint perfume. One painting stopped him in his tracks. A young woman, sitting in a classroom, light streaming through the blinds, her expression calm, eyes lifted toward the sunlight. On the chalkboard behind her, faint but clear, was written in white chalk, "Listen before you grade." He didn't need the name tag to know it was hers. He stood there a long time, hands in his pockets, until one of the curators came by and said, "Beautiful, isn't it? The artist said it was based on her teacher." He smiled softly. "Yeah, I think I know him." The curator smiled politely and moved on. Adrian stayed. He didn't take a photo. He didn't need to. The image was already imprinted somewhere far deeper than his camera roll. When he left the gallery, evening light stretched across the city, golden, forgiving. He walked past children laughing near a fountain, past a busker playing soft guitar, and he thought about how the world had its own curriculum, one written in moments of awareness, and the courage to admit when you were wrong, and the patience to begin again. That night, as rain tapped gently on his window, he opened his drawer again. Inside were the 3 artifacts of his redemption: Leela's diary, her sketch of him, and her final letter. He took them out, spread them across his desk, and realized something he hadn't before. Each one told the same story, not about guilt or punishment or even forgiveness, but about understanding. He whispered quietly to himself, "Teaching isn't about control. It's about connection." Then he smiled, closed the drawer, and turned off the light. In the quiet, his home didn't feel empty. It felt full, of lessons still unfolding, of echoes that were no longer painful, and of one truth that would follow him wherever he taught next. Even a harsh voice can learn tenderness. Even a mistake can become a lesson. And sometimes the ones you think you're saving end up saving you.